patience with me and Jennifer's patience with me as you were asking me what's the title of your talk, and I was trying to figure that out. Give me a minute. She was very persistent. Great, still duplicating. Okay. All right, so my talk today is about Tableau and Exasol and data governance. And for me, this is top of mind right now because we are in the midst of a data governance audit. So I had to kind of draw on some of my past experience before. Again, before I was at Piedmont, I was at KPMG for 6 years, and I did audit and advisory work and did lots of controls work in IT. So when the audit came up, I resurrected all my knowledge of doing that work and started putting together all the controls that we had built over the years and putting it down on paper. And this presentation is largely a result of that. So a little bit about Piedmont. Piedmont is now an 11 hospital system. When I started at Piedmont, they were just 4 hospitals, and I didn't start out in business intelligence there. I actually started out in the project management office where I led that team and business development for our heart institutes, our group of physicians that are cardiovascular. And then I think it was probably a couple years after that I moved into the decision support group within our system office, and now we serve the entire organization. So I exist in finance, so it's interesting, and that was really kind of my first project work that I did at Piedmont. But it really kind of morphed, and we cover pretty much anything and everything you can think of with Tableau and serving up data to people throughout Piedmont. So in total, we're looking at around 20,000 employees at this point. I haven't counted it recently, but Piedmont serves a significant number of patients across the state. Our hospitals reach from Columbus to Athens, but mostly kind of centered around the Atlanta metro area. All right, so since I'm going to be talking about Exasol, and some of you probably are like, I don't know what that is. Exasol is an enterprise data warehouse platform. So we implemented Exasol to basically solve a problem for us. We were having issues with scaling Tableau extracts. Tableau we love the analytics that it produced. We love that we can do self-service and put Tableau desktop in people's hands. But as we went from 4 to 11 hospitals and we implemented Epic, our electronic healthcare record system, the size of our data grew dramatically. And you know, had I known back then when I started at Piedmont just how complicated data in healthcare is, I'm not sure I would have ever gotten started. I probably would have been too intimidated to start, but I was ignorant enough to say, yeah, I got this, let's go for it. So data size has grown enormously, and basically what separates Exasol from a lot of other traditional database vendors out there is it scales. So a lot of, it scales out, not just up. So if you think of traditional platforms like SQL Server, you typically have to scale that up. Let's add more memory, let's add more CPU, let's add more hard drives. With Exasol, yeah, you can scale up, but you can also scale out. So it's a distributed system. So when you issue a query, it's a lot more like Google. There's not a single Google server that's responding to your request for search for cats. There's an array of machines that know all about cats across the internet, and they all come back together with the answer. Exasol works in a similar way. So they all have their part of the data. When you issue a query, it's all in standard SQL code, so it's not like you have to learn something new. They just speed up by adding more servers, and so there's less processing load per node. Okay, so one of the other things that's great about Exasol is it's extremely fast. So I learned about Exasol, maybe it was from Tableau Conference initially when they were one of the vendors that was on the vendor floor. And then I also learned about it from Andy Kriebel. Andy was actually at Apple at the time. Andy and I go way back from the beginnings of ATUG when Andy worked at Coke. And then once he went over to Facebook, he had some experience with Vertica and with Exasol. They were doing a proof of concept. I think at the time, I'm not sure what Facebook's doing today, but at the time they decided to go with Vertica, and per my communication with Andy, he thought Exasol was a better product, but I think the pricing strategy was different at the time. It just didn't work out for Facebook. So I started seriously looking at them and was really impressed with the ability just to spin up a virtual machine on my laptop, get the Exasol database going really fast, and see wow, this is really quick, even on my laptop, running from it. So that impressed me enough to do a kind of a formal proof of concept, and has led us to where we are today. So this is what our Exasol environment looks like. We actually have the top environment production cluster. We're in the process of implementing the alternate production cluster. We scale Tableau, or structure Tableau this way as well. So we have 2 alternate clusters. One serves as production, and then when we go through an upgrade cycle, we upgrade the alternate production environment, make sure everything's working correctly, and we just shift the traffic, so there's basically 0 downtime. We're going to do the same thing with Exasol. So we'll have that alternate production environment, we'll upgrade it, and then we'll shift all the traffic after we move the data. So it's a pretty significant database cluster. There's 6 active nodes and 1 reserve node. That reserve node is there in case one of those other servers fails. Then basically, there's some redundancy on each one of those boxes, and they can transfer data to the reserve node and come back online. It's actually online the whole time. It's just kind of slower during the data transfer. But there's a lot of redundancy built into it. And then we've got 4 terabytes of RAM that we've allocated to that actually in the new cluster. The current cluster has 1.3 terabytes of RAM. So to give you some sense as to the amount of activity that's going on in this database and why the extracts were failing us, we have today between 30 and 40,000 queries per hour that Exasol serves up through Tableau. So if you didn't know this about Tableau, Tableau issues a lot of queries. So we really discovered that when we started looking at the logs and just seeing how much activity was going on. Every little filter that you drag into Tableau, the visualizations, trying to figure out what is the domain of values that are possible. I mean, any given dashboard might issue 20-something queries to serve that up. So that's a lot of what you see in these 40,000 queries that are going on. So a lot of activity. And since it's a kind of a dueling database discussion today with Carl talking about Snowflake a little bit later, I thought I'd give this very high-level overview of the 2 products. I'm by no means an expert in Snowflake, so this is just kind of my understanding of the product, so Carl can correct anything that I may say incorrectly. So Exasol is a product that can be both in the cloud or on-prem, whereas Snowflake is a cloud-only database. Both of these have a scalable architecture to them. I look at Exasol as being a platform that's probably more cost-effective on continuous workloads. So as you saw, there's a lot of activity going on all the time. The pricing structure is different with Snowflake. So it's really more effective or cost-effective when you have more intermittent workloads versus just continuously using it as a workhorse. Exasol, from my experience and other people that I've seen do proof of concepts with it, works at ludicrous speed, whereas Snowflake is more like light speed. And then Exasol is a little bit older product, so developed by Gen Xers. And then Snowflake, I assume, is probably developed by Millennials. In case you missed the joke there. Have y'all seen this movie, Spaceballs? Yeah. Light speed is too slow. We have to go straight to ludicrous speed. I think there was another joke in there, but I'm just going to let that stay. I'm in between generations, so I'm really out of horse in this race. I think I'm what's called a zennial. Had an analog childhood and a digital adulthood. So I have no horse in the race. So y'all can throw out all the generational jokes you want. All right, so the scope of this is really limited. So we're talking about data governance, but data governance is really kind of this broad, sometimes nebulous topic. But I'm going to get very specific on 3 specific areas. So access controls, change management, and computer operations, and show you how we operationalize these things at Piedmont. So disclaimer, I have my one area of the world at Piedmont. I don't own all the things at Piedmont, so the scope of this is also just limited to what we're doing with Tableau and Exasol. So it does not include the other hundreds of applications out there which are managed separate from our department. Okay, so let's start with access controls. So what is part of access controls? And so I pulled this, again, like from my background as an auditor at KPMG, we had this controls narrative that we would be responsible for auditing and looking at these particular areas. So access controls is information security policy awareness, configuration of access rules, access administration, identification and authentication, access monitoring, super users and physical access. Since I'm not really on physical access, I'm not going to talk that. But I'm going to go through each one of these areas in detail and show you how we actually execute on these things. So for security policy awareness, that's making sure your users know what is appropriate to do with data, what they're allowed to do and not do with the information. So our first control there is the annual compliance training that Piedmont does that makes them aware of various laws and regulations and their responsibilities to be good stewards of Piedmont's data. The second control is what we do in Tableau beginner training. So everybody that gets a Tableau desktop license, they have more access to data than the general population does. So we just make sure they fully understand what their responsibilities are. So as they come through our beginner training, which is it used to be a 4-hour class, but we just never could get through everything. It's actually an all-day class that we do now. Part of the content in that session is to teach people what they are allowed and not allowed to do with data. And the third control really is something that we're looking to put into place with Tableau 2019-4 once we go live on that. We're currently on 2019-2. So if you're not familiar with the new features that are coming in 2019-4, which is yet to be released, one of the things you can do is on the actual login screen, you can put this little link. So you can kind of see that on the right side. There's a little red arrow pointing to it. It says comply with HIPAA. That can be a link that directs people to other information. So right now I just was playing around with it and I linked it direct to the government website that tells people about HIPAA regulations. But we'll probably link that to something that we create. We're looking to use Confluence as a tool to aggregate knowledge management information and present that to users. So it may be a page on Confluence or something on the internet. The other thing is you can have these banners. And so I gave Tableau some feedback on this because maybe somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think everybody can actually hide these banners. I'm an administrator, and so I haven't tried this as a non-administrator to verify. But on the banner, in the previous release of Tableau, there was a default Tableau banner that was there that would direct them to the training website, other kind of helpful information about how to create projects and workbooks and various things like that. But now below that banner, there's actually another thing where you can customize it. You can provide information, you can provide links to things. My feedback to Tableau was, I don't want people to be able to hide this. I'd like for that to always be on display. And two, I'd like to be able to put more on it. Right now it seems you can only make one line break in it, so there's kind of a limit to the amount of information you can display. But I still plan to put our information security policies out there so that people say, I understand this stuff. And probably the disclaimer will say if you're using this web page, you agree to our terms and conditions, just like all the mobile apps when you download them. I'm not sure if that holds up legally, but people put it in there. Okay, configuration of access roles. So this is how we define certain roles that have access to data and information, making sure that it's appropriate based on their individual responsibility and there's proper segregation of duties across the system. So within this, I wish this was bigger on my screen here, so we have things that we configure in the Exasol database to help us with this. So managing groups on Tableau Server can be a chore, particularly if you're managing individuals in those groups and then you're assigning, this is what you should be doing, you should be assigning groups to projects and you should be locking those projects down to a large extent instead of just being a free-for-all. We do still have free-for-all areas of Tableau, but we make sure we set the default rights to be basically nothing so that people have to select certain individuals. And we will label those things like QA, use this for testing before you move it into a production folder. Our production folders are all locked down and they're based on group rights. And so we manage those groups using scripts and tables in Exasol. So those scripts are basically Python code that use Tableau's REST API. And since we're bringing PeopleSoft data, so all our HR data is coming down into our data warehouse, into Exasol, we can look at the job codes that people have, we know what departments they belong to, we know what level they are in the organization, and we can design these rules that we store in this table that say, the people that match these rules are in this group. And then that gives me a list of people, and I can use my Python script to actually write that back to Tableau Server. So every day a job runs, and it makes sure, based on the daily census data that we get from PeopleSoft, that all those groups are up to date. And we have this, you may have a better governed Active Directory environment than we do, but we have found it wasn't that reliable. It was good initially, like if you joined this department, you were at this level, you were in this group, but it was really poorly managed. So we lost faith in that and decided, well, let's just build this ourselves using these rules. And the cool thing is, because you can use regular expressions in Exasol, we can make one rule that serves a lot of different things. So that top one is the leadership ladder, and it works for levels 8 through 19 in the organization. So everybody's in a leadership role, and level 8 through 19, this part of the first part of their job code, would be in the employee workbook access. And so any content that is allowed rights to that employer workbook access group is assigned automatically. And if you have individuals, though, so we'll only approve permanent access if it's approved at the job code level. If it's approved at the individual level, it will always time out because those people can transfer into different roles, and then their access is no longer appropriate. Handling that, so if someone's granted access by exception, 30 days or 90 days are kind of the limits that you have to select from. So this is just some code that shows how this actually works in the database. So I'm not going to go too much into detail, but just kind of point out that we have that Tableau group job code table, which you saw on the previous slide, and that's connecting to the employee census current data, which we import into the data warehouse, and then it just kind of matches only job patterns, and you might be able to see the regex instr, so that's like looking to see if your pattern matches, and it will return a value something greater than 0, and if it does, it knows that person should be in that group. And this is the Python script we use, so this is just a segment of that Python code. So it connects to the Tableau server. It downloads the list of people that are currently in the group using just standard Tableau REST API calls, and it populates a dictionary in Python. Then it connects to the Exasol database, runs a query, and it compares those two lists and adds or drops people as appropriate. Oh, and one thing to point out here, you would typically have to embed your password in these scripts to connect to the Tableau server to perform these administrator responsibilities. Make sure you encrypt that. So there are encryption packages in Python. You can encrypt that, store that on a file that in a place where generally people don't have access to, but the script has access to, and decrypt it. Okay, so the next thing is, how do we link our users from Tableau to the database? Because the way we have it configured, and actually with a newer version of Exasol, you can pass through the authentication. So the user logged into Tableau is the user logged into the database, but we have, I think, 40,000 people that can access Tableau Server, so I'm not putting 40,000 people on the database. It just didn't seem realistic anyway. So our system account, our Tableau system account, is actually what connects to the Exasol database. But at that point, I've lost the context of who the person is. So if I want to implement security controls at the database layer, I have to have some way of connecting these two things. So whenever a user connects to a database, they create a session, and there's a session ID that goes along with that. So what I need to do is say, okay, this particular session ID is associated with this user that's logged into Tableau. And so the way you do that, when you create a connection into Exasol, and this works with other databases too, most of the ones I think at this point support initial SQL. So if you edit the connection on your data source that you've got in Tableau, you should see an option to add initial SQL. So that box you see here at the top, where did I get my water? The box you see at the top is the initial SQL statement. So all you do is copy SQL code that you want to run in here. In this case, what I'm doing is I'm inserting into this table called, in the Tableau monitoring schema called Tableau sessions. And I'm putting the session ID from the database. So current_session is a Exasol command that just supplies the session that is serving that query. And then who is the Tableau server user? That's the next field in there, and that's really the most important thing. And I timestamp it, so I have all this information. I think I've actually got a script that cleans this up, so sessions that are older than 30 days or 60 days, I think I actually purge out so the table just doesn't grow indefinitely. All right, so then that, having written to the table, having connected to the actual Tableau sessions table where I'm connecting the database ID to the user, I can then tie that to that job code table and the census data, and I can say whether or not this person is in a certain group or not. And then that manifests itself in usually like a where exists clause in the database layer to say, let's display this data if the user is part of this group by linking through these tables that we've got set up. Okay, so the way this kind of looks in the SQL code, and I'm sure that's super tiny there, but I have a big arrow pointing to something, so that probably means something. All right, I threw these together probably like over the last couple of days, so I have to refamiliarize myself with them. If an authorization record exists, display the data, otherwise show unauthorized. So if I get any results from querying this table from the logged in user, if any records come back at all, then I know that user is authorized to see it. So you'll see in there if the count is greater than 0, where they're authorized to see it in the patient table, and address line 1 or address line 2 or home phone number. We've also got this set up for column level security and not just to create groups on Tableau Server. Then it'll actually display the data. If I don't get any records back, then it just puts in unauthorized. So at the Tableau layer, when somebody drags address line 1 or even patient name is a sensitive field for us, if that user is not authorized based on their job code, it won't show the data. And the cool thing is, it's just a single data source. So some people can see it, some people can't. And even if the author of the report may not be able to see it, but they could put that field in there and publish up the report, and people that are authorized to see it can still see it. So they're kind of, the author of the report and the user of the report are disconnected from a rights perspective. Okay, so I mentioned this, that you should have your projects on Tableau Server configured so that they are locked down largely. You will have exceptions to this, I'm sure, as we do. But by and large, we want to have a very simple environment to publish to. So when people publish to these project folders, they fully understand who's going to get rights to see the data. And we really want to control that as much as possible to make sure people aren't sharing data with people that they shouldn't be sharing it with. So the way in which you do this is you go to your project, and I think you click on, it's either the ellipsis or the little information icon, I forget at this point, and then you go to permissions. And from there, on the top right, there will be a button that says Edit Content Permissions. I got a little red arrow pointing to it. And then the first option under there is to lock that to the project. So that means the rights that you actually put on that project folder, the users that are publishing to that can't change it. They are what they are. And then the groups that we have in here are the ones that are being managed by our script and based on people's self-job codes. The other thing that you really should do, if you especially have any sensitive data in these data sources, is you should disable the ability to download the full data set. So under the workbook section of rights in your project folder configuration, you probably want to flip that to an X, where you see under the interact and edit section. And if you mouse over those icons, it'll give you a little tooltip that tells you exactly what they are. You want to disable that ability. So what that means is if a user goes to a dashboard, you can click the download option in the top right of Tableau Server, and you can say download data, and then there'll be a tab window that opens up, and one of the tabs says full data. So if the field is in that data source, it'll come back associated with the records that the user clicked on. Doesn't matter if the user built that into the report or not. So you may be assuming we have sensitive data in this data source, but the user didn't actually put it in the dashboard. They didn't use it in the report, so they can't get to it. That's not true. So you actually have to disable this on Tableau Server, so something to be aware of. All right, so next topic is access administration. So we want to make sure that we are properly authorizing users, and they have user IDs and passwords. We want to make sure it's appropriate based on the job responsibilities. And this is really about the ongoing maintenance and granting or revoking of access rights. So the way we handle this is that table I showed you is actually a web form in front of this. So I don't want to have to go in and type into my table or write insert statements or update statements into my database to actually control this. What I'd really rather do is create data custodians that are responsible for certain buckets of data, like clinical data or employee data, or those sensitive fields within the clinical data sets, or financial data. So we have custodians that we've set up that are executive leaders in the organization that get emails from these forms, and they decide whether or not to authorize anybody that doesn't have access already. So initially we went through an effort and we figured out these job codes should all have access to this, but we weren't going to catch everything that way. So this is a mechanism by which people and new job codes get created all the time to get access to this content. So you have to be a manager above. So the web form checks what level are you when you log in, and knows who you are when you arrive. And if you're a manager above, it presents you a list of options and it says, okay, I'm requesting access for clinical workbooks or employee data, and I'm asking for a specific person, or I'm asking for a job code that reports to me, or perhaps a contractor. Piedmont has tons of contractors that work for us, from PRNs to physicians that aren't employed. Some of them are medical directors within our organization that are actually contractors. So they have the option to pick that. If they're a contractor, it has to be somebody at Piedmont that's manager above, that's basically a custodian or sponsor for that person's access. So I mentioned with contractors, they can only get access for 30 to 90 days. So every 30 or 90 days, depending on what was approved, an email will go to the person that requested and say, is this still needed? And if they click yes, then it opens up the form. It'll actually already be pre-populated with everything they put in before. They can make tweaks to it and resubmit it very easily. And then, yeah, actually, a way we kind of direct people to this form too is we put this information in the information on the project itself. So to get access to the content in this project, everybody in the company is a viewer of the project. They can see the project folder, they just can't get to the content within it. So that means they can see the description of the project, and within that description there's a link that takes them to this form. So what happens then is an email gets fired off to one of the data custodians, depending on the area. In this case, it was one that went to our chief medical officer and his delegate for helping with this process to access clinical workbooks. So this person requested access for a specific individual, but the custodian can choose, I actually want to just authorize the job code, as opposed to just granting an exception for this person. I see the job code, I read its description, I read the justification that you supplied. It makes sense to me that this person in this job role would have access. So they can permanently approve that job code, and then there's no further action. Everybody else that gets hired into that job code, as they come and go, they'll get access as well. So in this case, what happened is they clicked the link that says they wanted to grant a 90-day exception to the person. So that email then goes to the person that requested and lets them know, hey, this is, you've been granted access to this role. And we can customize the email that goes back to. So for the ones that are granting rights into groups in Tableau, it takes 24 hours because of that script only runs once a day. In the mornings, so we tell them, wait 24 hours before you tell us it's not right. For the one that's access to sensitive fields, since that's a live connection to Exasol, that's instant when that happens, so we let them know that that's occurred. And a new control that we are adding to this to just add an extra layer of security. It's harder to do security on an analytics database than it is actually within an application. Because you're typically asking for bulks of data. So technically, like, you're not supposed to look at your own records as a Piedmont employee. But I hit my records all the time because it's analytical data. I'm like, sum all the charges, I'm in there, you know? So it's harder to do that. But for those lockdown fields, address, phone number, name, you actually have to supply a justification now every single day. Even though you've been pre-authorized to see the data, if you're going to pull that, you're going to have to do this break the glass sort of thing. So before those fields will display, you actually have to enter a justification of this. This writes into Exasol. Exasol looks to see that you supplied a justification that day, and then it actually displays the data. So it doesn't prevent them from accessing it, but it does require that they enter some information about what they're doing, and that gets periodically reviewed by the data custodians. All right, next one is identification and authentication. These are really more about password sorts of things, how you know that the person logging is who they say they are. So the slides I've got in here really just by configuring Tableau Server. If you have Active Directory, you can configure it to connect to Active Directory. Highly encourage that you use some sort of identity service that your IT shop uses as opposed to just going rogue and managing users yourself. It just never goes well. So yeah, in Tableau Server, there's TSM now. It used to be tab admin commands that you would do for this. Now there's actually a web page that you can configure all this stuff when you're setting up Tableau Server. So just make sure it's connected to your identity management system. Exasol, likewise, can also be configured that way. So there's a place where you configure the LDAP server. So when users connect to Tableau, which is mostly my team or the data architecture team or the Tableau system account, it actually connects to the LDAP service. Make sure that that user's entering the correct password. If their password's expired or they're terminated, you know, they're not going to get access directly. That's another reason why you want to use identity management system for Tableau. If a user happened to still get in the building and you forgot to disable them with the Tableau layer, but your IT shop had already disabled their account, you want to make sure those are in sync. Okay, monitoring controls. So making sure we do periodic access reviews, largely detective controls to make sure that our logical access controls are working, and reviewing segregation of responsibilities. So one of the things that we monitor is contractor access. So I want to know, what are all the people that are not actually employees of Piedmont doing with our data? What are they connecting to in Tableau? So every day I actually get this. So contractors begin with a certain letter with their ID. So everything that they do shows up in my inbox. Now I don't look at and review all of this stuff in detail, but it's more of a history log. So if something were to happen, I have evidence of what that person did. Something you should be aware of is that Tableau Postgres database, where this is being pulled from, I think it's 180 days. Does anybody know any differently if that's the default? Does that sound about right? I think that's right. 183 specifically, Nelson knows.
Pull that here.
You can actually change that setting, but the database size can get kind of very large if you make it too large. You could actually I could transfer this into Exasol and keep it forever, but I just have not done that yet. All right, so also want to know, what are people actually doing? So if I wanted to audit the actual queries that people are running in Tableau against Exasol, I can find that data. So it exists in these log folders. So it's sure it's really tiny on the screen, and it depends on where you install Tableau. If it's like on your default C drive, but we change it to the E drive, I think. So it kind of moves it. I think if it's the default, it goes into the program data default folder. But if you move it to a different drive, it's actually in the folder with your Tableau install files. But essentially, it's in the data, tab services, logs, and there's these VizQL server folders and data server. Actually, those are files. VizQL server files and data server files. So it reads those files in, and they're basically these JSON data packages, and it writes that data into the Exasol database for me. So I actually have a log of everything that came from Tableau, and I push that into Exasol. So if I ever needed to discover what people... Another thing, just from a performance standpoint, I look at this one. So I have this so that data that got that I showed you just got written into Exasol. I connect Tableau to that table, and I can see the users, I can see the queries, I can see how long it took to process that, I can see how much data did they return, and so I can easily find the outliers. So one I've got highlighted there was a select the patient encounter CSN ID, which is a very detailed contact data point within our database from our orders table. The orders table probably has 500 million records in it or something like that. And so to process that, it had 31 minutes to figure that out. And there may have been other things going on, so you see my WTF question mark. And for me, I was like, why is Tableau even doing this? Like, what is this person doing? So what I figured out is Tableau sometimes does some stupid things, and I've been pressing on them to fix the stupid things for a while now. Hopefully they'll listen at some point. But what it is when someone drags a field onto the filter shelf, it asks for everything. So I have a data source out there that has 3 billion records in it, and this one field is the primary key in it. So you drop that in, it's actually going to ask for all 3 billion records, and Tableau is just stupid about that. It really is like thinking, oh, I bet they're going to work with SuperSource sales data, so it's not a problem to ask for everything. So yeah, this doesn't work very well when you ask for all that. And probably the reason this happened is actually in Exasol at the time we had 600 gigs of RAM instead of the 1.3 terabytes that we have. And you'd be surprised just how many of these tables people use. And Exasol is an in-memory database, so it pushes all that data in RAM. And so when you ask for something very granular from this really massive data set, it says, do I have this in memory already? And if not, it'll load it up into RAM. And if it needs to make space for it, it will. So it probably kicked a bunch of other stuff out of RAM at the same time. So you want to avoid those situations. So if you'd like to help me lobby Tableau to fix these things, let me know. All right, so another place where we can do monitoring, so resource usage against Exasol. Again, I don't want all my RAM getting kicked out, so I can easily monitor the queries from the log files that are in Exasol. So you actually have to turn that on. So when you configure your database, there's a place where you can check the box if you want to do auditing. And it'll keep all of that data perpetually, so you'll need to set up a job periodically to just purge the data so it doesn't become huge. But again, I've got Tableau attached to this. It tells me how much CPU, how much RAM, how much network bandwidth did it use. And I forget what the last column is. But I can mouse over and I can see the full SQL query, where it came from. Most of the time it says Tableau Server, because I said it's disconnected, but I can easily associate that. And usually what I do is I'll find something in the query that looks unique, that probably a bunch of people weren't asking for, and then I'll just search the Tableau log files and find that with a Python script. All right, super users. So you want to make sure that you've got good, tight controls over who your super users are, and make sure you're monitoring that. And so from a logging standpoint, it really is those controls I just talked about, where you've got log files in Tableau Server, you've got log files in Exasol, you can see what your administrators are doing. So even if an administrator tried to mask their activity by deleting the log files, you can see the administrator deleting the log files, so you might question that. So on Tableau Server, what you would want to do is if you have multiple sites, you want to go to the All Sites section of Tableau Server, look at your users, and then there's a max site role thing on the right side that you can select. You can pick your server administrators, and you can see who all those people are. You should look at that periodically to make sure nothing looks crazy. The other thing, the site administrators don't have as much as the server administrator privilege, but you still probably want to keep an eye on who those people are, because they could do some damage if they were to get disgruntled. All right, the other place is at the database layer, you want to make sure you know who your DBAs are. Who has the super user level access within the database. And with databases, it's a little bit more complex because there may be individual privileges that are pretty powerful themselves. Things like the ability to grant any role to somebody, which they would be able to grant any role to themselves. So let me grant DBA to myself and get all the things. Grant any privilege, so they could grant another special privilege to themselves and then grant themselves DBA rights, so you want to make sure you monitor that. Or alter any user, meaning they could reset somebody's password and they could log in as them. So we have a report again in Tableau set up, so all of the privileges and all the roles that people are in, I can see who those individuals are and what specific privileges are associated with them. So I get this in my email once a week and I just look it over to make sure nobody's changed anything, because there's a handful of DBAs. Keep an eye on. All right, so this moves us into change controls. So two areas I'm going to focus on here. There's more in the official audit log, but they weren't really relevant to me. So I'm focusing on authorization, development, testing, and approval as one area, and then the migration of production controls is the second. So really, this first section is about having a formal methodology by which you do development. Don't just cowboy it or cowgirl it, whichever, and figure it out yourself. Make sure you've got good controls in place. Make sure you're testing what's being developed and it's doing what it's supposed to do. So the way we do that is through Agile. Raise your hand if you know what Agile is.
Never seen it with big.
Oh, there's a story to that. So I asked that same question.
Can't wait.
So we have a Scrum Master, and he supplied this. So the Scrum Master is basically, what would be kind of a project manager in traditional waterfall project management kinds of development. Scrum Master basically organizes this. So to give you some perspective on why Agile is so much cooler than traditional project management, is that our Scrum Master manages about 40 simultaneous projects going on. So I have a pretty decent sized team. We have a lot of work going on. At any given time, I was thinking on the way to work, I'm like, how much stuff is going on? I came up with 30 in my head, just that were happening right then that I actually had some knowledge about. But it's typically 30 to 40, and this one guy manages all of that, which is super impressive if you've ever done project management work and you think about all the cat herding that you have to do. So a lot easier, because in Agile, you set things up in 2-week increments or whatever you define your sprint period to be. For us, it's 2 weeks. And we get everybody in the room that's responsible for that. So that's actually all the pigs in here. Who's actually responsible for work? And we sit in that room and we put things into the sprint and we all nod our heads and say, yep, we can get that done during that cycle, which is way more effective than the project manager going around and emailing, hey, can you get this done this week? When are you going to get that done? The effort involved in that is enormous versus just getting people in the room and agreeing. 2 weeks is not that big to kind of estimate whether you can get something done in. Okay, so another part of it is just like backlog grooming. So that's, we intake stuff into the backlog, and we know at a more macro project level, these are the things that we want to do. And we divide that up into quarters and say, these are our goals for the quarters. We want to get these things knocked out. And then we structure the work into stories, and we estimate the effort on that. We assign it to people, and we agree on the work in sprint cycles. So to Nelson's question about the pigs, so apparently there was some joke about this, and I don't know all the background. Tarsh just said, yeah, there's a cartoon about it, and he kind of explained, I found this on the Googles. So it's the pig and the chicken here, and there's actually chickens in it. You can see the stakeholders of the little chickens that in the top there. So the pig and the chicken get together, and the chicken says, hey pig, we should open a restaurant. And he says, I'm not so sure, what would we call it? And the chicken says, ham and eggs. And so the pig, kind of puzzled, says, no thanks, I'd be committed, you'd just be involved. So if you're going to make hams, the pig has to be slaughtered. Chicken can just lay the eggs and he's fine. So alternate, what if I'm committed as well, the chicken says. I don't see how you could be, says the pig. I know, we can open a lunch place called Wings and Ribs. And so the pig's in, yeah, they're both committed to it. So that's the story behind the pigs in that graphic that this consultant firm created. All right, so we manage all this stuff in a tool called JIRA. Who's heard of JIRA? Oh, a lot of people. Are you using it? Yeah. Some people love it, some people hate it. I'm in the love camp. I think a lot of it comes down to how you actually manage it for us. So for us, a project is really a team. I know some people create projects in JIRA and it's called a project, so you would think it's a project and it has an end date. For us, they don't. It's just we have an area that people are responsible for, like hospital quality or enterprise services, which would include things like HR and supply chain, or maybe operations areas. So they have a team and they're a project in JIRA. Then they have these things called epics, which is also super confusing for us because our EHR is epic. So we always say that and they're like, well, they're always confused. So an epic, though, in JIRA for us is really the high-level projects. What are we trying to accomplish in this quarter? And then the middle section is where we're looking at the backlog page in JIRA, is where you plan your sprint out. And so I said those are 2-week periods of time. And you see the list of all the individual tasks or stories that we need to do in that 2-week period of time. People are assigned to it. You see their little icon next to it, and there's an effort point assigned to it. And we initially had a lot of pushback on the effort point thing because it's not hours exactly. You know, we're not putting hours, putting effort points, and it's intentionally vague because as the effort points grow, your uncertainty about what it'll actually take to get the work done grows as well. So it goes in this sort of Fibonacci scale, which we also get laughed at about because it's not exactly the Fibonacci scale. But it's like 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, and then it goes to like 20 and 40, and people are like, yeah, I'm not buying it anymore. But if we have anything that gets into like 20 or 40 range, we're like, this is too big, this needs to be broken down further, so we'll take those tasks and further subdivide them to get them to the place where they're kind of small in effort point and gives us a lot more certainty about the work. So we'll groom all that out in the backlog grooming session. We'll get to the sprint, and you really should have an idea at that point what you actually want to do. And you plug that in, you all agree, and you start the sprint, and you repeat that process over and over. And yep, you document all the details on the sprint. We've pressed that. A lot of times we would go in there, so our Scrum Master would be sitting in the meeting, and people would say, oh, we want to do this, and he would type that in, and people are like, yeah, I know what that is. And then you get to the stand-up meetings. So stand-ups are what are happening in the middle of the sprint. So for us, we just do them on Tuesdays and Thursdays. It's overkill for us to do those every single day. There's a quick 15-minute conversation about where you are with your activities in that sprint. And that looks like this. So this is the active sprint. So we have these little swim lanes that have the statuses, to do, in progress, on hold, validation, and done. That's customizable in JIRA. So people just drag their tasks to the right. And our stand-up meetings are a discussion of this. So we get to these stand-up meetings, and we'd call out somebody because their picture would be next to it, and I'd be like, I don't know what that is. I'm like, we're in the meeting. So we want to make sure we're pressing. You actually have to put in a description. So if you walked in there and the Scrum Master enters this for you, and you're in the room, it's your responsibility to go back and add the detail to it after the fact. So we don't want to hear that you don't know what that is because you were in the room. Although, I don't know if that was true originally, we've made a policy now, like you can't create tasks and assign them to people if they're not in the room. That's always fun. It usually happens when they're on vacation. All right, so then migration to the production environment. Number one, we want to make sure not everybody can migrate to production. This is mostly true for us for Exasol more than it is Tableau. Tableau is a self-service environment. We've got 370 or so desktop licenses throughout the organization. And my team is 18 or 19 or something at this point. It's tough to keep count. Now, I was the first employee of BI, and then for 3 years it was just 3 of us, and now it's 18 or 19. So you don't want all of those people to be able to migrate code in the database. So we have the management layer is basically DBAs on Exasol, and so they review the code that people have developed in their own schemas, and we move that into a development schema as part of our review. And then we've really started doing this too, so we can make sure all the details that I just showed you in JIRA are linked to the things that we're publishing up. So if it's a view that we're creating in Exasol with a series of code that serve a dashboard, we put the issue number from JIRA directly in the description and part of the chain log. At the view at the top, we have a description of what it is, who made the change, what date was it made on, and what JIRA ticket was it associated with. At the Tableau layer, when you publish up a workbook, there's a description section. Highly encourage that you put some description there that explains who asked you for this, who built it originally, and have a change log in it as well. Because inevitably, people leave the company and there's this thing sitting out there that somebody now wants support for, and you have no idea what the background is on it and who the business owner should be anymore. So make sure you're leveraging that. And again, we put the JIRA issues numbers directly in that. So I mentioned that it's less critical for us on the Tableau side. People can publish to production folders at will on the Tableau side of things. But we highly encourage that the work go to a QA project first, work with a small subset of users before pushing it out to everybody for them to see. And then on the Exasol side, it's the management team, like I said, that can only migrate code into production. So part of what we also do when we migrate information into the data warehouse is we track all the lineage of that information, because we want to make sure people have confidence about the data they're using and where it's coming from. So from the source system, that if your vendor was doing their job, they actually documented what was in the tables. Epic's really great at that. I've run into other vendors that really suck at that. And there's also rules that typically manipulate that data, so you want to make sure that part's documented too before it makes its way to the presentation layer. So there's several places where we document a lot of this stuff. Some of these slides are older. This was a different database system that we had. It had its own metadata management system associated with it. So you can see all the code that was being used to transfer data into that database, and there would be comments and data stored as part of that system. We also sometimes create these spec sheets for things that document information. So we've recently built this metric framework, and people consume metrics from all different areas of the business. It's all consolidated in one place, and a lot of that gets built out in these sprint teams. So as part of the business owner's responsibilities is to fill out these spec sheets that say, this is what makes up the numerator, this is what makes up the denominator, this is how we attribute these different dimensions, like a location, a date, a person. There's generally multiple ways you can associate dimensions to data. So we want to make sure all that's very clear. We'll PDF those documents and put them on a web server, and we'll link them to the dashboard so people can get to the definitions that way. At the Tableau layer, and this is also that Tableau hasn't worked out as a bug, on the data sources themselves, you can actually put in a description on those, which is fantastic. The problem is, I've got this metadata script that will go through, and as you see when you mouse over fields, you get this little tooltip in Tableau desktop that tells you what's the definition of this field, where did it come from in the source system, and if you were linked into like a master table or something, it would tell you how all those tables are joined to a transaction table. So all that information is there, but it's written in this Python script using the Tableau REST API. And when you republish the source to the server, the description goes away, so it kind of defeats the purpose of putting in a description on the data sources, which is kind of frustrating. And then in the dashboards themselves, so you might want to have a definitions tab, or even better, I didn't put a screenshot of this in there today, in the latest version of Tableau, or it may even been the one before, where did the hidden containers come out? Was that like 2019 too?
The button thing,
yeah.
Eyeglass?
Yeah, although it's a hamburger menu now, that was the beta with a little eye thing, which is kind of weird.
Yeah.
So now you can create these like vertical and horizontal containers, and if they're floating, you can choose an option to hide those things when you click the little hamburger menu, and then it flips to an X, so you can close it again. So what we've actually started doing is we've standardized our header at Piedmont, and we put this little question mark icon in the upper right next to the Insights logo we have for our kind of branding for our data products. And when they click that, a vertical container comes up, and it actually has a web page that's in it, so you can grab web objects inside of your dashboard. So we put it in this container, and the cool thing we built on this is that the web objects themselves reference a web server that we've got control of, and we've got a JavaScript part of those web pages that calls a standard header, and there's just general purpose, how do I use Tableau stuff. So every help page we build out will have that header in there automatically. There's no special thing we have to configure. If we want to make additions to that, we make one change to one web page, and that propagates to all the help files that we put in all our dashboards. So highly encourage that you do stuff like that to help your users understand the data. It's a little bit of the Wild West on Tableau Server, and not everybody does that. But the business users using the dashboards really appreciate it when you do. So it's something to be cognizant about.
Are those JIRA pages, or are they just web pages?
They're just web pages that I have a web developer that had a web server. I'm like, hey, can you let me put files on your web server? He said, sure. So it worked. All right, operations controls. We got like 10 minutes left here. So this includes job processing, backup and recovery, and incident and problem management stuff. So job processing is making sure that they are completed accurately and timely, all the stuff. So that's data transfers. It's all these scripts that we use to manage our user groups. All that processing is happening based on our time scales that we've got established. And so some of the things, these are just some reports that we've got out there for monitoring. This one's looking at who's misbehaving on our database, who's keeping sessions open that are consuming memory, whose queries are running way too long. We have a script on the Exasol side that looks for queries that are, if it's coming from Tableau, I think we've set a cap. It cannot go longer than 5 minutes. If it's more than 5 minutes on Exasol, there's something wrong. If something wasn't built right. So this will automatically kill anything from Tableau that's more than 5 minutes from our development team, because they're probably building custom data marks per thing and processing a lot of data. We've put a 30-minute cap on that, so they can't process anything more than 30 minutes. Again, if they're building a data mark, it took longer than 30 minutes to build that on Exasol, something's wrong. Nothing should take that long. So this script kills it, and this report lets me monitor all of that. Another thing I want to keep an eye on is what's the size of all the objects in my database, because I don't want to run out of disk space. This is something you're going to want to monitor on Tableau too, and I think I have a screenshot of that as well. But there's all these stale objects, and people have their own development schemas in our environment, and they'll put data in there, they'll build views, they'll materialize those views into tables and attach Tableau to that, and sometimes they'll just leave them there and forget about them. And so this report will identify how big are those objects on the database, and how long has it been since something was last committed, so something last changed, so that nobody's touched the thing. So the really old stuff is what we want to delete, and I recently customized this so that I set it up so there's a filter that ties the logged in user to Tableau to the person that owns this object in the database. Put that in as a filter, and I subscribe my whole team to it and the data architecture team, so when they get it, it's already customized to them and say, hey, here's all your objects that are really old and really big, please do something about this. Okay, so then another thing we want to make sure is as we make changes, and this is a good change control slide here too. So as we make changes to the underlying table structures, sometimes there are views that depend on those table structures that break, and we want to know what those things are that broke. So I've got another Python script that checks the view integrity and makes sure that is this thing still working. So it just runs this arbitrary select one from the table where 1 equals 0, so nothing comes back. And if the database produces an error, it writes it into a table in Exasol, and the Tableau report gets emailed to me every day with the objects that are now broken, and it gives me a description of what's broken. So because our environment's also really complex with healthcare data, a lot of these data sets need to be materialized into tables before they go into a Tableau. It's similar to like what you might do with an extract in Tableau. But this just creates a table in Exasol that Tableau connects directly to. So we monitor all of those jobs as well. So this is an example of those reports. I can see each individual job making a row in here. What is its normal start and end time? That's kind of that background gray bar. The foreground darker bar may be orange or black. If it's orange, it's more than one standard deviation from the norm. So that's a clue to me that something's not quite right with this job and I need to look into it further. Maybe it was conflicting with some other transaction on the database and I need to rearrange things, or maybe I need to list out something as a dependency that I hadn't because it's being worked on at that time. And it gives me trending information about what is the typical runtime of those jobs. And I think, let me see. Yeah, so our longest materialized job in there was 19 minutes. So if you do a lot of data processing in your own databases against massive data sets, maybe that means something to you. But what we're used to do on SQL Server, sometimes these things would take 5 or 6 hours to do, whereas in the Exasol database, our longest one we got here is 19 minutes. I'll skip over that one. So backup and recovery is another thing you want to make sure that you're monitoring and you're doing, because the last thing you want to do is invest all this time and energy into a database or in a Tableau, and then something breaks on the hardware side, you've lost everything that you've done and have to rebuild it. So make sure you have good backup and recovery procedures. So I've got some reports that actually will monitor. This is a disk usage data set, but I can actually see all my backups happening on this because on the primary worker, or it's not the worker node, but the primary node on Tableau Server has the backup file on it, and it actually transfers that backup file to another server. So you can see disk space dropping every day and then going back up. If I didn't see that, I know something's not working on my backup job that I need to check into. On the Exasol side, there are system tables there that tell me all my backup start and end times, shutdowns and startups of the database, and when the backup failed or was aborted. So I can investigate all that too, something you want to be aware of. Because it's easy to set this stuff up and just assume it works. And then you find out when something happens catastrophic that you don't actually have a backup file to restore from. So make sure you're keeping an eye on that. All right, and then let's see, for incident and problem management, we actually have two systems. So JIRA, which I talked about already. If it's something that we identify on our team, we just log that in JIRA. We have an infrastructure sprint, which is all about optimizing our current environment and building new self-service data structures. If something breaks, is an issue we need to handle, we actually just put that into the current sprint. It's tagged as a bug in there, so it has a different icon. It has a bug fix kind of red tag next to it as well, so you can easily identify that stuff. And then it gets talked about in our stand-up meetings that we have. For things that our end users are reporting, that's going to come through our heat database. So front range heat, has anybody heard of that one? So that's the ticketing system that our IT department uses. So that's how we would get notified from our end users. And so that is just another place where we keep an eye on that and manage our incidents and problems. All right, and that was it. So anybody have questions? And if you want to, you can follow me on my Twitter or my blog. I'm not as active as I used to be, but a lot of information that I talk about I end up putting on my blog at some point. So it might be something good to follow. So.